Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by Nadia Eghbal, aka just Nadia. There's Kanye, there's Elon, and there's Nadia. Nadia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Erik.
So Nadia, when you look at the work that you have done the last decade, sort of the writing, the researching, I'm curious, and this could be sort of a general introduction to the episode, what is sort of the thread or threads that you think underlie or undergird your curiosity? I'll take a stance at it, and then I want you to edit or add to it. So I see you as predominantly interested with how the internet enables creators, researchers, artists, maintainers to make a living doing what they love on the internet. And sort of if Ben Thompson is focused on what the internet does to big tech companies, you are what the internet does to creators and individuals.
Oh, that's pretty good. I'm going to steal that and use it. Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of thread tying together personal interests, stuff I've done, everything, is this interest in content creators on the internet and just people making interesting stuff and understanding both like why do people keep making interesting stuff and like, yeah, why do they do it? What motivates them? And then also how do they make a living doing their work? And I think we often think about this stuff as like hobby, passionate kind of stuff because people love creating things of their own accord and they're intrinsically motivated or whatever to make these things. But I'm also interested in helping people think about that a little bit more seriously of like, this doesn't always just have to be a side project kind of thing. How do we actually take that seriously if we think that knowledge production is very important, socially important to all of us? How do we actually help people realize that value? I think now is actually maybe more interesting than in the early days of the internet because everything was so new then that we didn't really have any like preconceived notions of how things could or should be working. We just sort of like taking offline models and applying them online. But now that we've had, let's say like 20 years of data or whatever about the internet and seeing like what it looks like when people make things and put them online and how like all our distribution channels are sort of changing over time. There's a lot to actually like test and push back on and be like, oh, this doesn't actually work the way we think it does, or things are actually getting harder as, we try to produce and distribute this kind of content at scale. There's just a lot of like really interesting stuff happening right now, I think even more so than in the early days.
Yeah. And so if Ben Thompson's sort of, discovery was aggregation theory, that the economics of the internet work, that big tech companies focus on aggregating demand, whereas newspapers used to work by aggregating supply and having monopoly over the supply side. What do you think is your equivalent or closest thing to equivalent of what you've discovered about how the economics change online from offline for creators? What's the closest equivalent you have to aggregation theory?
Come up with a theory on the spot here. Something, I mean, I'm not going to even try to answer that. But some interesting observations I think I've been noticing. And this, I mean, a lot of it does parallel, or I'm continually inspired by a lot of Ben Thompson's work. One of the things he talks about is this like atomization of the individual and sort of unbundling of firms. So if you look at like something like journalism, it's, there's one narrative you can tell about, newspapers are shutting down and everything's set on fire and oh God, what's going to happen in the future? Or you can kind of tell this like parallel, really interesting, optimistic tale of if a newspaper is a collection of like a bunch of journalists and some of those journalists are sort of like standout individuals that, can capture more value from their own brands and like they give more from their own brand to that firm than the other way around necessarily, right. And can strike it out on their own. Then like, what does it look like when those people kind of start going off and doing things independently? And I think it's actually like a really awesome time for independent content creators, but it requires this sort of like unbundling of institutions, and really focusing on like the value that like individuals bring. And so I think when I think about sort of like early days of the internet, we were much more focused on people producing things like communally. And so when we even think and talk about communities now, a lot of it is this sort of like many to many sort of, interaction with one another. And we don't think as much about like the one to many kind of interaction because that's sort of a newer thing. And so there's such a heavy narrative in how we make things online that is like very much about participation and about community and like everyone pitching in and everyone like, doing things together. And I think like what's sort of understanding that narrative is the power of individual content creators or individual or just anyone that can like gather a following, an audience for whatever reason. And yeah, how did the dynamics change? And I think like one of the big ways that dynamic changes is what we expect around participation. And so I've been trying to think about more about, I guess, creators putting things out there. And like, I think one of the big open questions is like, how do they manage the participation they get back from their audience? And you can see it sort of like in the way that a lot of our social platforms are designed, where it's like anyone can comment on your posts influencers or whoever like see all those comments, and like, are they expected to respond to it all? Like at this point, I think we understand that like you can't.
It's tough for us out there, Nadia.
Yeah. Hard life. Yeah. I mean, like everyone feels it's like their own email, right? Where it's just like, I have this like, and now with proliferation of like lots of different messaging inboxes, it's just like, I can't respond to all this stuff. Like, what am I supposed to do? And
the inbound.
Yeah, the inbound. It's hard to be popular. No, but I think like everyone has some version of that. And so it's like thinking about like, how do we redesign these systems to, like, I think of it as this sort of like one-way mirror kind of model, where it's like behind the mirror, you have like a creator who is making stuff and it's sort of like protected from the outside world, and they can choose to interact with the outside world as much as they do or don't want to. And obviously they're sort of like influenced by the aggregate of it. Yeah. But like people are not necessarily like, if I think about like an internet forum or something, like sort of that the classic model of collaboration and content creation, it's right. Everyone's kind of like pitching in together and having this conversation. But I think we're kind of moving towards this model of like it's just me and I'm going to field stuff and have to like filter through as much as possible of, in order to.
I don't want to touch on that. I think that's a good example of sort of a broader interest I see you as having, as to be sure you've focused on how can make a living, and in the last few years you focused on open source, and you've written a lot, and you have a book upcoming, and you work for GitHub and Protocol Labs, but also and you experimented with your Helium grants, your micro grants, but I also see you as a child of the internet, as one might say, and also interested in how people make meaning on the internet, and how people have friendships on the internet, and how our platforms are designed to help create that, or how they influence that. Would you comment? What would you say that these sort of bigger than how people make money on the internet? You're interested in sort of how internet infuses in our daily life, how we think, how we see other people.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's why like some of this is, sure, it's about like how do you make a living doing this stuff full time, but like part of it is, I think, very innate to the experience that we're all having online in some shape or form, which is just like, wow, I can talk to anybody. So how do I actually figure out how to filter for like the most important interactions without like pissing off other people? And it used to be maybe like, it was obvious that you don't respond to, I don't know, maybe you just like don't respond to random people or something like that, and you only talk to people that you know personally. But like even that at a certain point is like, even if I filter for all the people I've met once, like I still can't respond to everyone. And you see these sort of like internet first relationships and friendships of like sometimes it's really great to talk to random people. And so like how do I actually mentally like filter around all of that? Yeah, I mean it's funny. I feel like I've even been like personally experimenting with like how do I maintain my friendships and relationships, and for me it's like super blurry between like who's an internet friend versus a real life friend. And like some of my like Twitter friends I feel closer to in some respects than like real life friends, and vice versa. Like newsletters have actually been really fun for this. I do like a monthly newsletter update, and over time, originally it was like a newsletter for keeping up to date with like all the open source research I was doing. But over time, it kind of became more about like Nadia's personal thoughts and ramblings about the internet or whatever, which has just been a really fun medium. And like, sure, I talk to like subscribers who I don't know at all, but like there are also people who subscribe who know me personally, and it's been actually kind of nice to have someone, if I'm catching up with them in person, to say like, oh, I saw your last newsletter about whatever, and then it's like, oh, we don't have to do this like
how's it
getting
going?
Yeah, the getting each other up to speed kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I have friends who do like just even like smaller personal newsletters where they send stuff out like weekly or monthly, being like, here's what I've been up to. And it's actually like a really nice way to keep in touch with people without having to like individually keep up with everyone. So I feel like we're all sort of like figuring out these ways of adapting, but we're doing it all very slowly.
Yeah, one of your newsletters, you covered this guy who was building, what was it, a Memex or something?
Oh yeah, Max, the externalized brain.
Yeah, so you're interested in externalized brain. Let's talk about this a little bit.
Well, I think it kind of goes back to this again of there's so much content coming into our brains. How do we actually organize it and not keep it all in our heads? And I've noticed there's a sort of like philosophical, I think there's sort of like a philosophical difference between, like a lot of people talk about this like spaced repetition kind of thing of, which to me philosophically is the approach of like, how do my brain can retain more information than it currently is, and how do I like stuff as much as possible into there?
Yeah.
And then
facts,
I think,
facts.
Yeah, just like more facts. I mean, like literally, it's like, just for listeners, I guess, like it's this practice of, you have like flashcards or whatever, and you're like repeatedly reviewing facts or things you've learned about people, the world, whatever, and like over time you review them like over longer periods of time, and then eventually it sticks in your memory better apparently than if you just learned it once and didn't think about it again. And so that's sort of like one, I guess, way of thinking about it. And then there's sort of like other people who, like me, I guess, who are sort of like, I trust my brain to like naturally filter for what it cares about and doesn't. I don't really want my brain to be this like, I don't think of it, I guess, as like a machine that I'm trying to like extract something out of. I think like whatever it's doing in there, I don't really know what's doing in there, but like it's doing a good job. And, but at the same time, like I still have way more information and than I can like retain in my brain. And so I almost think of like an externalized brain as a way of like offloading that stuff into something else that I can access if needed. But not having to keep it all in like active memory. And so for me, like one of the things I do is I publish like most of my private notes online every month, and it's just like a page on my website, or it's like throughout the month I just write notes to myself on my own note-taking app, and then at the end of every month I go through all my notes, and I post most of them except for like sensitive ones or whatever. And it's just kind of a way of me being like, well, like I don't have time to write a blog post about all this stuff, and like I just kind of want to get it out there. This is like as close as it gets from like inside of Nadia's brain to like outside, and it's kind of nice to have these like pages of just like notes that I publish online, and if someone else finds them interesting, cool. If not, whatever, it's just there and I can reference it. And I've often found in like conversations on like Twitter or whatever, like sometimes someone says something like, oh man, that reminds me of this like note I had from whenever, and I can like old school like go back and like screenshot it and like respond with it or whatever. It's like
right. And one of the things you've written about is that you wish that there was a place where you can more naturally think out loud and see what others are thinking out loud, and that Twitter and other platforms don't really satisfy that because the immediate sort of feedback loop of a like and comment. What is it not doing there, or what would that get? Like, why is that?
Yeah, I think it's still filtering for something, right? Like, I guess the way I've started to think about social platforms is sort of on this like spectrum of like hyper public to like, maybe like totally private just to you. And then there's sort of like semi-private in between. But these are like, there are gradations of like public to private spaces and what we expect from them. And so like, just given the amount of people that you are reaching and potentially interacting with on something like Twitter, like that's as public as if I were like saying something out loud on the street or something like that. And like, there's some things like, when I decide what I want to say out loud to say, I don't know, a group of strangers at a bus stop or something, like, there is a filtering process, hopefully for most people, that you go through of like, what can I say here or not? And so I think similarly we have that with something like Twitter, but then for me, like, there are these like semi-private spaces. I think like newsletters, podcasts are like really interesting emerging mediums for that. And then like we see like an interest in group chats or just, these places where the information is not necessarily hidden, but like you kind of got to dig a little bit to get there. And that kind of naturally filters out like who you're talking to and allows you to be a little bit more authentic. And then we of course have like super private spaces like me journaling to myself or whatever, which is all the way on the other end of the spectrum. But yeah, so when I think about like Twitter's still really great and I use it and like I love it. But the stuff I'm going to say on Twitter is just going to be like kind of different from the stuff that I feel comfortable publishing on like a random page on my website that is technically public. Anyone can go see it, but like I'm not making a point of like advertising it.
Right. It's a natural filtering mechanism for people who really want to see your stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's what's cool about the idea of just like externalizing your brain is it's not meant to reach everybody. Like it's just a matter of saying, here's as much of myself that I can kind of like dump out into the world. And if you care enough, like you're basically like creating like a library or something of your brain. And if someone wants to dig around the archives of your library and like go through all the books and figure out what you're about, like great, it's all publicly available, but you're not like forcing people to interact with it.
Right. Yeah. So, and one element is creating something where people can more naturally think out loud in a less judgmental way so that people can have hunches and you can build on top of these hunches. There's another, Yancey Strickler had this post you linked to called The Dark Forest Theory of the Internet, where I think he was basically commenting if Paul Graham had this post a few years ago, I forget what it's called, The Things You Can't Say or something like that, where he talked about how, people with audiences are now not just not publishing anymore because, or not publishing what they really think because the upside is too low, the downside is too high relative to the upside, and maybe they're going to these, quote unquote forests where there's, i.e. private chats. But is that just sort of another way of saying just a space for reasonable people, i.e. no trolls, racists, or libs? Like, is that really what people are talking about when they talk about dark forest? It's like everybody who can hear my thoughts without like canceling me.
Sure. Like, I think to one extent, I mean, it depends on kind of what you want from it, but like, yeah, to one extent, it's about like, how do I filter out the like complete riffraff, or undesirables or whatever, so we can have a productive conversation. I think like maybe on a slightly more optimistic note, it's also about finding your tribe or your people. Yeah. Like when I think about the group chats that I'm active in, it's often just like friends that like, and you can be in the same group chats with, like there are different people crossing over between them, where like sometimes like this particular configuration of friends is just like really great about like talking or joking or thinking through a certain set of topics, and this other configuration of friends, which might include some of those people, but not all of them. And so I really like that idea of just like curating the spaces that you have these conversations in. But yeah, I mean, like I think this is where patronage and subscriber models get really interesting, because like it is about finding, like, to me, it's sort of like this long-term realization of the like 1,000 true fans kind of thing, of like some conversations are great for reaching like everybody in the public, and some things are just like nicer to have in a smaller space. And I do think we have like a finite limit to the amount of people we can let into that space and expect to have a reasonable conversation.
Yeah. And you also linked to an article that talked about how the 1,000 True Fans is sort of not as glamorous as people think, that that's really hard work. And there is the difference between sort of like, you might have 1,000 True Fans in your newsletter, but you don't charge them. And that's sort of a different relationship than if you did. Maybe you'd feel more accountable. Like you could just take off a month in terms of your newsletter, or how do you think about this? Like I don't charge on Twitter or my writing, but if I did, it'd be pretty different. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I probably would have had a different take on this until recently, but my boyfriend actually just started a paid newsletter over the weekend, and like I guess he did it as an accountability mechanism, which to me, like I've always said, I don't want to charge for my newsletter because I want this to be kind of free form space for my thoughts, and like I don't want to feel like I'm being paid to do it. Suddenly it's just not going to be as fun anymore. Whereas he took the opposite approach of like, if I know that there are people that are like paying and waiting for me to respond, it's like a great accountability mechanism to force me to write every week or whatever. So now I guess I've seen both sides of it, and I can see the value. And it's the same thing in like open source, or anything. I think any creative work that people do as like a hobby, like sometimes introducing money can make people feel weirder about it. Sometimes it could be great. Right. Well, yeah. So the funny thing about like subscription models too is like people think of it as being like into perpetuity because it's recurring, but like something I would be really interested in seeing more people do is like limited runs of subscription models. Yeah. So I haven't charged for these, but I did do 2 different podcast series that I hosted. And for the first one, we did it for 2 seasons, and then we kind of felt like we had, like, it was great fun, had a great audience, but decided like we had learned what we wanted to learn, and so we like just wanted to stop after that. And then the second one I did was more of like a passion project, and it really was just like me and the other person wanted to have a conversation, and like decide to just do it as like a 10 episode like release. And it was actually really like, I like the constraint of we're just going to do 1 season and we're like not going to do anything else. And for me, it reminds me of like TV shows where, like some shows run for like 10 seasons and you're just like, oh my God, like this isn't even good anymore. And then there's some that are like 2 seasons and get like a really weird cult following around them. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I don't think we have to be like obligated to do this stuff into perpetuity. Like, yeah, you could have a newsletter that you're running for like a year or 2 years and say, I'm going to do like an annual subscription, and like, that's it. And then we'll see if we have another run after that or something like that.
Zooming out. So you've dabbled in nonprofit space, academia, philanthropy, venture capital, and you were sort of disillusioned with parts of all of them. And it's not just you, it's them. How would you sort of characterize what some of the problems you saw were, or what they have in common, or how that maybe led you to open source? Or Yeah,
so I think like a really interesting, most of these things you're talking about, they all kind of run on grant funding of some shape or form, or you don't exactly know what you're getting for when you pay for something. It's sort of like, this person is doing interesting work and we fund them to think out loud or something like that, which is sort of the problem that I keep chewing on over and over again in different permutations. I think a lot of the perceived issues around like academia or nonprofits or philanthropy are that they aren't really tied to any sort of output. And so it's like, you end up seeing these sort of like weirdly bloated or overly institutionalized situations where like people are just sort of like running on grant funding without any accountability. And so it ends up naturally swinging towards, at least like with, I mean, it depends on the space, but like with like nonprofits, for example, like you can have like certain like I think philanthropy's gotten really good at basically like the growth stage kind of funding of nonprofits, where like the really big nonprofit organizations like still run on grant funding and have these like regular funders. But then it's like, well, what about like the seed stage version of that, where it's like, how do you fund like innovation? How do you find like interesting individuals and give them money? And there are a lot of like reasons why that's not super easy to do right now. So if you think about like academia, which I actually think is, it almost, I think it gets like too much flack these days of being this like totally broken institution. Cause like if you think about it, it's actually pretty cool that we like created this entire system and economy for like people to think and research all day and put their stuff out there. At least that's the dream or the goal or whatever. But if you think about like what it takes to do that, like getting a PhD takes a really long time. Not everyone wants to go through that whole funnel. Getting tenure is like not guaranteed and requires like, if, you know, citations and publishing papers is your metric of reputation and success, like not all the work that people do in academia fits neatly into that. And so like in some ways having such a mature system constrains the sort of like interesting, weird thinking that people can do. Yeah. And same thing with science, where it's like, yeah, interesting, weird scientists who just want to like experiment and don't necessarily want to get into this like grant funding kind of treadmill, like where like, how do they actually fund that? And so, yeah, I think like the disillusionment or the kind of griping that I'll hear about, and also personally feel around a lot of these institutions, has to do more with maybe seeing the signs of like a mature grant-based economy. But I think like in some ways it's actually pretty cool to see that like that has even been institutionalized at all. But then in other ways it's like, well, like, yeah, what are the ways we can kind of offer things more in the early stage, seed stage side of just like weird, interesting individuals doing cool things. And so that's why I'm like really interested in like independent researchers. And like, if we just sort of see, at least I feel like I've been noticing more and more people that are just like writing about interesting stuff or like, sharing that on Twitter or, doing, newsletters or whatever, just like content creators. And if they're just doing it their own accord as their own like interesting people, like there are probably different kinds of models we can think of for supporting them besides the institutions that exist right now.
Right. And you spent some time in venture and you were excited about some of the things there, but you sort of felt, and not the words in your mouth, that there was a whole class of people of which venture was not appropriate to, and they needed a funding model as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I've gone, in some ways I disagree with past self, and in other ways agree with it more maybe, of, yeah, there's something sort of underserved for people that are generating interesting ideas and creating interesting content and putting it out in the world. Like, I don't think VC is usually like the right path for them. In other ways, I think I've come to appreciate venture capital as like, one thing I've thought about is like whether it's the business model for philanthropy itself, of because you're tied to market returns, like you actually end up getting like venture funding actually like funds a lot of weird, risky things that they know aren't going to return. So in some sense, you actually see a parallel to philanthropy there, where like they would never call them grants, but you know, there are definitely investments that just like don't do well, and it's fine because someone else like subsidizes it essentially, right? Which is actually pretty cool to think about, and I think I've gained some appreciation for that, and just the fact that like, yeah, you'll really know whether stuff paid off or not, which is not. It's a lot harder to measure that kind of success in pure philanthropy. But yeah, I think like there's a different class of just like interesting people doing weird stuff that like, you know, they're not going to necessarily, like the idea of like starting a company around that sometimes just, I mean, it doesn't even make sense. And so there needs to be some other kind of like business model or way of thinking about it. And I think like grant funding is an interesting way to kind of fill all these like pre-market opportunities, or maybe like opportunities that just don't necessarily fit into the market in the same sort of way that I'm interested in exploring.
Yeah. And the question is that, government sponsored funding and research led to a lot of innovations around the internet. And was that sort of a coincidence that happened, or was there something inherent about public spending that is better or different than private spending? Because we're seeing a lot of public spending, things like space and even, military with now Anduril and stuff, like go more private. And is that uniformly good thing that we should all be excited about?
Yeah, I've had my views challenged on this recently, so I don't actually even know how strongly I feel in any direction anymore. Like, I guess one view that I've had is that public goods have generally historically been funded by the government, or we have a government. Like, the reason government exists is to be able to cover those kinds of things that we don't have to think about, like, how do we raise money to pay for, like, the roads outside or our sewage and plumbing or whatever, or just, like, someone else thinks about that kind of stuff for us. And it's interesting to see there are, like, historical examples of, like, initiatives that started as, like, were initially funded by philanthropy, like our 911 system, or libraries were funded by Andrew Carnegie, that eventually became to be more associated as, like, government kind of programs. I've generally felt, I guess, more bearish on the idea that government plays that role now. I'm open to, I guess, being challenged on that. And, like, maybe it's just that everything on the internet is so new that like, it's just taking government time to catch up. But I feel like I've seen, like, a really strong divide between, like, government still does it still does a job, I guess, of dealing with our, like, physical world kind of public goods, but it hasn't really caught up that fast with online public goods. And so online, like, especially because, like, there isn't, like, a government of the internet, right? Yeah. There's sort of, like, de facto governments. Like, I think a lot of our platforms, like, essentially play that role. But yeah, I mean, like, who would even really be responsible? Like, which government is even responsible for some of these things? And so you see sort of, like, instead, like, citizens or just, like, individual people that are coming together to fund these kinds of public goods, which is where crowdfunding, patronage, subscription models, et cetera, just become interesting. And so, yeah, I don't know that I feel if we're talking about, like, military space, maybe that's a whole other level of funding that's separate. But when we think about, like any sort of, like, creative work is a public good. And, like, the way that stuff kind of gets funded, I think, is more from individuals than we can expect from government.
Yeah. You've written about how, the super wealthy today don't have the same philanthropic sort of instinct that perhaps they had in the past, because maybe we have more of an ethos of liberalism or individualism today. I just read The Sovereign Individual this weekend, and it talked about how we are going to transform from seeing ourselves as citizens to seeing ourselves as customers. And when you see yourself as a customer, you're not going to pay for something that doesn't help you necessarily. And then also, you've thought about, in different contexts, just private versus public good. You've thought about social media platform context. But I guess in the world in which we transform from citizens to customers, do we see, like, is there a public good? Like, how do we? What comes to mind here for you?
Yeah, I mean, I do push back on the idea of customers in a transactional sense of, like, I think this becomes especially challenging in the realm of content, because, like, one of the biggest misconceptions I think we still have about content is that that you're paying for the content versus paying for the person behind the content, or paying for a sense of membership or closeness, which I think parallels this question around people, I think, will be interested in funding these kinds of public goods if they kind of if it helps them draw a boundary around who they are as, like, members of something, like an idea, society, whatever. So, sorry, this is a little bit abstract, but, like, yeah, if you imagine, like, an individual charging for subscriptions to their paid newsletter or whatever, like, you're not paying to get the newsletter. Like, it's not really about the content. You're paying to be part of that person's, like, secret special group or whatever. And in that sense, I think people are making meaning for themselves around, like what is my social space, or, like, what am I a citizen of, right? And I think it's going to look more tribalistic than in the past, or just more, like, localized, where, yeah, and, like, no one is a part of, like, the Twitter community, right? Like, I mean, what does that even mean? But, like, I might consider myself part of, like, tech Twitter or whatever. There's some smaller version of that, and, like, you can get even more atomized than that. And so, yeah, I think, like, part of it is, like, I think part is just like we're just trying to make meaning for ourselves in like much smaller spaces.
Yeah, it is interesting. Product Hunt, you talk about like Product Hunt community. At what scale would it have to get at which it no longer becomes a community? Or was it always?
Or was it ever? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a line?
I mean, yeah, I hadn't thought about Product Hunt specifically, but like, sure. I mean, like with any, I guess, new company, there's probably some early ethos of like people are just like very excited about it early on, but yeah, I don't
just go a community of communities like Reddit. Like is Reddit a community of communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like there is something to be said about like a Reddit user, like you can kind of picture like who that person is, but then your deeper affiliation might be to like a subreddit, which is your actual community.
Okay, so then you discovered the biggest blind spot on the internet, which one of the posts that you wrote is basically what got you most excited about open source, this sort of dissonance between what people thought about it and what it actually was. And those two main points being that people thought that it was a lot of people, or that it was a very collaborative effort to be a maintainer, and that they were doing it just for the love. Whereas, hey, like anybody else, they would like to make some money doing it. And it was actually it was a very small percentage of people maintaining, a lot of core infrastructure for the internet.
Yeah, that was definitely the part that got me super excited, or just like really caught my eye, because I wasn't even necessarily looking to get interested in open source. I didn't know anything about open source going into it. And like, honestly, like sometimes I wish I had found something easier to talk about at cocktail parties, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, I mean, I was looking for the part that really caught my eye about talking to open source developers was realizing that there was this understated narrative around like there's a very, very strong rhetoric around open source software being this thing that is built by like a community of developers. And you have this mental image of everyone kind of rolling up their sleeves and pitching in. And in reality, it was a lot of these projects that were like super widely used by like millions of people, relied on by like, biggest companies out there that, we're all sort of indirectly relying on, were being maintained by like individuals. And they didn't feel like it was very collaborative at all. And I got extra interested in it when I realized, like, talking to friends of mine who did have more familiarity with open source, that like a lot of them were super dismissive, and they were just like, no, that's not really how open source works. Like, you don't understand. Like, it's actually fine. It's this like gifting economy, and everyone's very intrinsically motivated to participate. And I was just like, this doesn't line up with like, the stories I'm hearing. So that's what compelled me to dig deeper. And yeah, over time, over the past whatever number of years I've been looking at it, my own views have been challenged around like, it's like, okay, we've identified that a lot of these projects are run by individuals instead of by communities. Like, what do we do about that? And like the earlier hypothesis I think I was testing or coming in with was you need to get more people to contribute. And it's sort of like, this is a problem. We need to get it back to the state of like being a more communal thing and people pitching in. And I think that view got especially tested like the more developers and the more projects I got to know at GitHub, and realizing like, no, there's actually something deeper going on here where like that narrative might have never been true. It might have just been like, to me, it parallels again, this sort of like the early internet days where you had this like, really like a cult around like openness and this like dogma of openness, and like everything needs to be open and everything is like super communal and participatory. And then you kind of see the reality of how things shake out at scale, and it's like, no, not everyone is participating and pitching in on things. Like, this stuff usually falls in the hands of like a couple of people, and then a lot of other people like consume and benefit from it. And so I was sort of forced to rethink a little bit around like, well, like, what if we assume that this isn't wrong, but this is actually just a new way of being? And like, how should those maintainers think about managing their projects? Maybe it's not about getting more people to participate and contribute. Maybe for them, it's about like filtering the noise of their interactions, or learning how to like rely on automation to like remove some of the manual work that they have to do and things like that. And so then I started getting really interested in like, what are the adaptive strategies that these individual developers are dealing with to manage like thousands of interactions with casual participants, and then realizing that actually mirrored a lot of like what other like content creators are doing today, whether it's on Instagram or Twitch or YouTube or whatever. It's like you have this model of like one person that is like putting out a lot of stuff, and like tons of people are consuming it, and there aren't always clear barriers between like someone who's purely viewing or consuming versus like participating. Like, that's a much grayer spectrum than our products are currently designed for. And so, yeah, how does everyone learn how to adapt to that kind of world?
Right. And you made some analogies from, maintainers to, you looked at other like journalists or researchers or YouTube creator, what sort of was, or streamers, what was sort of similar or different or something you found interesting comparing maintainers to a different group?
I guess the one big thing that is different is like code actually runs in production. Yeah. So I see a lot of parallels between like thinking of code as content or thinking of open source maintainers as creators. But like a primary difference is that if a YouTube creator decided to stop making more videos, like nothing in the world will necessarily break. Like right. People will be sad, but they'll move on. Whereas if a maintainer decides to stop, like if someone like pulls down their code, then sometimes the problem can be fixed very quickly, but like it actually has very real effects on like everyone else and the software that is like actively relying on it. And so I've gone back and forth between like whether the right narrative, the original narrative that I kind of pushed forward in the research I did was thinking of open source code as infrastructure. So like everyone is relying on this stuff. It's like one person who's maintaining a project that is used by like millions of people or whatever. And that this is a form of infrastructure in the same way that like roads are a form of physical infrastructure. This is the infrastructure that like all of our software relies on. And I still think that's true with relation to the code itself. But then you have this other narrative that's sort of like the people behind it are like other content creators, or influencers or whatever. But I think overly leaning on that narrative kind of, can sort of undervalue the very real dependencies that are there. Like, yeah, if a maintainer doesn't feel like responding to like a critical security vulnerability that has been reported to them, like there could actually be very serious repercussions.
I just did a podcast with a couple partners from Benchmark, and it was on infrastructure open source investing, and they mentioned that they like has a dozen or so companies that they call open source companies that are unicorns. So there's a lot of money that's been made. I guess it just hasn't flowed back to the people who actually created it.
Yeah, and to some extent, I think that's a problem with like all protocols, right? Yeah. If we think of if open source code is like infrastructure, it's a lot like protocols, which like often don't capture the value.
Right. But people were excited about that in crypto.
Yeah, they're excited about it. We'll see what actually pans out, right?
Right. Do you think that there was some just misunderstanding there, or is it all, who knows, it's early something?
Yeah, I could speculate on a lot of things, but I think it's cool. Jury's still out.
So, yeah. How do you think about open science? I was asking a science friend if could a GitHub for science work, and she was like, wouldn't make any money. But a lot of people are interested in science. How does open source as it relates to science make sense?
Yeah. So similarly, I think in both cases, open source software and open science both have their roots in this philosophy of openness, right? Like, it comes from, I think, like right now I would say we're almost in the era of like filtering or maybe like more closed or something like that. We're all trying to like rediscover meaning from this extreme openness. And we're all trying to like contend with our generational predecessors who were like really pushing this narrative of openness. And now we're like, maybe like totally open is not so great after all. And so both of them have their roots in this, like, in both cases, it's just like, we should be making this stuff as available as possible. I think the big difference between open source and open science is that science is very closely intertwined with academia, and academia has a reputation economy already in the form of papers and citations. And so if you're making all your stuff super, super open, you're basically undercutting your own work and reward there, right? Whereas like, I think part of why open source software could take off was because so many developers were doing this stuff in their spare time. They could have a day job as a developer writing whatever software, and then they could do like open source inside. And like the fact that it was so much of like, it was such a hobby for so many people meant that like they didn't really care about capturing the value. And like maybe that's come back now to bite them. But I think that really helped get it off the ground. Whereas like with open science, like it seems like there has been a little bit of like a stagnation around like, well, how much stuff can you really make open? Because like you're actually just undercutting your own value as a scientist. If you're...
And why hasn't there been a parallel reputation economy in academia the same way perhaps there has been with developers, right? GitHub is a parallel reputation economy to LinkedIn, for example, for developers.
Yeah, well, I would actually say it's maybe the other way around of like, academia does have reputation economy in the form of citations. The question is like, how good is it or not? And yeah, it's just like, it is in itself its own like closed system, and it's a closed economy that only really functions if everyone's participating in it, within like the context of academic institutions. Right. And so like, it's weird, I guess, if you wanted to reframe like academic research as another form of content creation, right? Yeah. Then you would say, well, like, how do other content creators monetize their reputations? Like, in my dream world, you would have more of these people that are just like sharing their thoughts and insights out directly on Twitter and like monetizing through a newsletter or whatever, long form writing that people pay and subscribe to. That would be really, really cool. It's really hard when like they've sort of been trained and their context and their peers and everything is like contained in this very closed shell system of academia that like to break out of it it's sort of like, I don't know, like being Amish or something and leaving the Amish. It's like you can't, and I don't mean that pejoratively in either direction.
No, that's where you came from, right? I'm just kidding.
Fuck you, Erik. Sorry. But yeah, they like, it's just that like anytime you have that sort of like closed system, like if you defect, then it's like, you either got to make like a hard defect or not.
Yeah. That reminds me of another thing. You were saying how, we too much openness and now we're trying to filter or curate. You've also thought a little bit about privacy and how does that segue into sort of your thoughts on privacy and sort of the gradations of privacy?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of what we were talking about earlier in this conversation about I think like we're starting to see this like natural filtering and segmenting of, different types of social tools, I guess, for lack of a better term, that serve different kinds of needs where, yeah, sometimes you want to have conversations that are in like smaller spaces and sometimes you're going to have them in like very big public spaces. But like, I think maybe we used to have this sense of, well, why can't I say this online? And, everyone's, if I say this, I get all these repercussions or whatever. And like, there's some part of me that's sympathetic to that. And there's some part of me that's like, I think we're just kind of naturally learning to filter ourselves in different types of public or private spaces. So, I mean, there are things I'll say on a podcast that I wouldn't say on Twitter for sure. And it's not that one is literally like more private than the other in the sense that like you can access both of those. But the person that takes the time to like listen to a podcast about me and then like, it's a lot harder to like take a snippet out of context and like tweet it out or something. I'm more willing to be open about my thoughts than I would be just on like Twitter.
Canceled.
I know, I'm like asking for it now.
So you're very excited about newsletters. You're excited about blogs. Creators. Let's talk about journalism for a second. Well, I guess one broad question is like, do we need Wired or Salon or like any of these sites anymore if people can just go direct?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I mean, not to call out specific firms or anything like that. I think like my understanding of newspapers is like the very, very biggest ones will be fine. Like New York Times or whatever is going to be fine. And then like everyone in the middle is kind of going to get squished. And I think, yeah, I don't necessarily think that transition is going to be pretty, but I think there is a lot to be optimistic about, as I've said earlier, of just like, yeah, like why not follow the specific person that I find interesting as opposed to a broader media brand that has a lot of garbage that I don't care about? Right. I think like there's still always going to be a place for, say, like breaking news or just like keeping up with like, yeah, what's going on in the world. But like, I think actually that level of reporting is just going to end up getting distributed out to like, let's say Twitter or whatever, where like a lot of news can get broken on Twitter or like you get people's weird takes about, and not, I just keep using Twitter as an example, but whatever. And yeah, like if that doesn't necessarily need to be an entire article that is like written out, like that part of the, I guess, like journalism needs market or whatever is going to get served by a different product entirely. Like I think it's almost like we need to kind of carve up like what is journalism actually for, and like what are the different kinds of content that get put out? Because I feel like people always talk about this like abstract of like, it's like, well, yeah, people write articles about a lot of different things. Right. But yeah, for like kind of deeper, thoughtful takes or just industry specific takes, like, yeah, why can't individuals take up that role?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Athletic has been so successful with subscription-based sports journalism, and it's brought it's a business model for local journalism for sports. And the question is, how far is there Athletic for lots of different industries, or is there something sort of unique about sports? And even Ben Thompson, the critique of stratechery for X is, hey, that works for Ben, but how many people will it really work for? And Substack is hoping that a lot more.
Yeah. I think this, like, it's kind of, it feels a little bit like deja vu from open source also, where like there are some specific examples of open source developers who have managed to strike it out on their own and like full-time living based on like subscriptions or sponsorships or whatever, writing open source code. But like people often look at those and say, well, it's just like, you know, that specific person, like how many of those are really out there? And I feel like it's sort of like we're like negging content creators or something, where we're sort of like, I don't know. I maybe it's just good to be, maybe everyone's just being realistic, but I kind of see it as like, hey, there are a couple of like really interesting breakout examples, and like maybe we should figure out what's working there and like continue to expand upon that instead of being like, well, you know, this is really a hobby for most people. Like it's kind of cute that we have one or two like full-time examples, but it's like, I almost just feel like people aren't like dreaming big enough to be like, oh, maybe something fundamentally different is happening here and we can actually replicate that elsewhere.
I want to zoom out and talk a bit about the sort of, let's talk about the creator economy and how that sort of evolved. So if my straw man here is like, there was UGC, and that's YouTube and other, you know, Zanga and LiveJournal. I'm just talking about my what I was up to. And then there's, you know, ad-based, you know, way to, make, you know, monetize. Then there's subscription based with Patreon and Kickstarter and that's if your stuff was really good. And then there's, you know, things like Substack if your stuff's not that good. I'm joking. I love Substack, but they're just like, the bar has gotten lower for you to make money on the internet. For somebody to make money on it.
Wow, you're negging content creators.
Yeah, the bar has never been lower, everybody. So, I mean, I don't know. How would you describe sort of the evolution of content creation? And where are we now? And like, is Patreon going to win? I don't know. Like, who makes money off this on the back end?
I think the winners are going to be people that find very niche audiences in a, like, sure, like display advertising is really about like building a really, really big audience and then being able to monetize off that. And I think like we kind of have to readjust how we think about this of if you are just one person and you're not trying to, you know, build an entire media company around yourself or whatever, you're not trying to raise venture capital or whatever, you're just trying to be you writing about your shit, then yeah, I mean, like there are people who can make a very decent living on like not that many people. And so I think like this one, like, I guess one of the cool things about like when I think about like the internet at scale or just like how our social interactions have scaled, like early days people talked a lot about like globalizing and about like, oh, we're going to take all these little, we're going to create this sort of like sense of like a global community or whatever. And now it's like, so
global village.
Not that.
Global village. That's what people said. Yeah, that was Marshall McLuhan. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. But yeah, I actually think it's going to look something more like highly specialized, focused, weird niches that are like, those are the things that are scaling, if that makes sense. So like it's made it possible for people with very weird interests to find other people with their very weird interests. And then like stuff that might have been previously very fringe or strange, or you were like the one person you knew that was really into this thing for good and for, you know, this is also where I think we see like conspiracy theories or whatever that now find validation for their views. But whatever the case, like you're seeing people sort of like doubling down on their like niche, super localized interests, but being able to experience it on a global scale. And so to me, that's like super ripe for subscription models because like you're looking for people that are just like rabidly obsessed with whatever it is you're doing and are, yeah, more interested than your average casual person. And it's fine. You don't have to have mainstream appeal. You can just, again, you get like 1,000 people who really care about it. And like, yeah, that's a business.
You know, I want to talk about the local global thing for a second because it's interesting that, you know, some people, when they complain about being lonely or the increasing atomization or that nobody has the same reality that they have. And so the alienation that comes from that. And so people want belonging, Nadia. People want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And guess what? Also, we have global problems like climate change and AI and nuclear proliferation that we need global coordination. So, I mean, is it infinitely local? I mean, like infinitely local is just you and yourself, right? Like, how do you see sort of an increase towards global cohesion, like, or is it just infinitely atomized?
I have no idea. I think part of the constraints, frankly, I think like we are constrained by our physical world to some extent of like we're used to thinking ourselves as like government as like a geographic concept is like made sense in a physical world, but it doesn't really make sense in like an online world. And so when we think about coordination, it's almost like confusing to be like, well, what member of a group do I belong to, and who is my community? And like, I think like just one of the big unanswered things everyone is just trying to do in some shape or form is like trying to figure out how to draw boundaries around their tribes. And like, it's funny to think about something like filter bubbles, which were seen as a largely negative thing, like, I don't know, whatever, 5-10 years ago, was something that people were like worried about. And now it's almost coming the other direction of like, oh God, we need to find our filter bubbles again because like this just isn't working. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be so bad if we ended up with like super localized communities, but I do wonder if there's maybe some natural consolidation of some of those communities.
Well, in the future world, maybe it's decades, maybe it's longer, where, you know, governments become startups and there's a competition for where to live. I'm curious, basically, and this is directly related, does it result in like 1,000, you know, Israels and Singapores and, you know, small city states with their own unique unique characteristics? Or, you know, people do love to be part of big shit. Like, you know, Michigan football games. Like, people love to be part of stuff. So I don't know.
That's where I think like your characterization of just everyone being super lonely. Like, I don't think, look, actually, like, it seems more that we're developing better filtration mechanisms for finding your true tribes, right? Versus, like, I don't think it has to be lonely at all.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, actually, like, it seems easier to me now to find people that like are suited to your interests than ever before. I mean, that's just the weird like internet kid in me talking or something. But
rub it into all our listeners out there.
Yeah, something actually I've thought about a bunch recently was like whether we're like, I think about these like generational moments that kind of define maybe us or like a parent's generation, or, you know, we can all think of, at least, you know, in the US, it was like 9/11, like JFK assassination, bombing of Pearl Harbor or whatever. And like you talk about this, or you have this visual of people just like gather around a TV or whatever and just like watching this thing unfold together. And I wonder whether we're going to continue to have generational moments like that. Like, what would the generational moment be of the next generation? I guess we can't predict that now, but like, because we don't have that visual of everyone gather around the same TV or the proverbial TV, experiencing the same thing at the same time. Like, if everything kind of breaks up into these like, filtered local tribes or whatever, like, we're all maybe having like quote unquote generational moments for our specific tribe, as opposed to like a stranger on the street who I could turn to and say like, you know, where were you at 9/11? Like, I don't know what I would say to them.
Right. What's interesting, I wonder, because everything you said is true, but I also think that the biggest moments, you know, they're trending on Facebook or trending on Twitter, everyone is seeing them. Like when Drake and Ninja were streaming, or like a lot of people were watching that.
When
like,
Fortnite broke.
There's just so many of them that is just death by 1,000, you know, viral things.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, right. This is true for memes and everything. It's just like everything just kind of like flares up faster and then dies faster and we forget about faster. So like there aren't as many like long lasting defining generational moments.
I liked your line of, in the future, everyone will be canceled for 15 minutes.
It's not my line. It's Gordon Moore's. But yes, I really wish I had thought of that because I think that's true.
So another idea you've had is that people are vessels for ideas. Talk about that. Why isn't it the opposite?
Maybe just because I find it more peaceful that way or something. I don't know. Or yeah, I definitely was thinking about, I wrote like a blog post about that. I was definitely feeling a little bit angsty at that moment of like, something I said to friends were, but like, I wish that maybe someone has written this. And if so, someone should point me to it of like, we had this like 0 to 1 concept or whatever, but like the like 1 to 2 is also just as hard of, you find success with one thing and like, do you ever like, can you replicate that? What does it look like to be a second time founder in Silicon Valley after you've had one really big success? And like, I think it's very easy to, just like criticize those people or hold them to really high standards. And like, but it's like, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like they could have just stopped after their first success, but they went on and did something else again. And it becomes really hard to break out of the reputation of your first time success. And so, yeah, that was sort of like one aspect I was thinking about with like people's vessels for ideas. And I guess maybe the other just being that like, yeah, I find it more peaceful maybe to think about like an idea, you're just sort of like a conduit for an idea that seizes hold of you. And like, maybe you're the person that like amplifies that idea out to the world. But then once you've kind of amplified it out, like that idea kind of takes hold in like other people and then it kind of spreads around like a virus. And I think I like experienced to a small scale of this, sort of with open source stuff of like, not everyone who's gotten really excited about funding open source developers has a position on it that I necessarily agree with. Yeah. Whereas like, I think very vividly to like 2015 or whatever, when I was first talking to people about it, and like there was a lot more unity around like, this stuff is interesting or whatever, because there just weren't as many people interested in it. And now like I hear just like, I mean, I can't keep up with everything that's happening now, but there are people that will just like be excited about. It's almost like weird if they say, you know, like I was directly inspired or excited by your work, but then they're doing something that like I totally would not be doing. And you feel this sort of sense of like, but that was like, you know, that was like, I had this thesis or I had this position.
Be inspired harder.
Like, you totally missed the message, right? But I think that's not actually the right take. I think it just takes a little bit to be like, oh, right. Like it's not my idea. I don't know. You know, it's just like something that passed through me and maybe I helped amplify, along with a lot of other people. And like, they're going to take it in this direction. And maybe that's actually like how these things live on.
I'm curious to talk a bit about, identity. And in the same way that physical governments didn't make sense transposing them onto the internet, maybe, you know, one identity or a real identity doesn't make sense transpose. I mean, it certainly works for Facebook, but, in terms of the future of the internet, how do you think about identity as it's, you know, how do you think about transposing on the internet? Is it plural? Is it pseudonymous? How do we think about anonymity? How do we think about real identity? And there is sort of a broader question about like, you know, things being transposed onto the internet and then the internet version becoming the mainstream version of it instead of just the e version of it. Does that make sense? Like it was like e-comic or e-commerce, but pretty soon it's just going to be commerce, and that's the internet. As we in the same way that transposing government onto the internet didn't exactly work, like a one-to-one copy didn't make sense. When we think about real name on the internet,
right?
And then as the internet dominates more and more of our lives, how will identity be shaped? Pseudonymous, plural?
I mean, it's kind of cool to see people with like alts. I mean, this is common on Instagram and Twitter of like, I guess I had previously thought of alts as like, you're trying to hide something. You're trying to say something dark here, right? Like there's something you do not want to be discovered here. But I think like a lot of people create alts not because they are desperately trying to hide some secret part of themselves, but because they're just like, I just don't want this tied to like my legal name or whatever. And it's like more common even outside the US, like some people are just like super comfortable with like, of course I'm going to have like all these different disposable throwaway identities. And I think it's actually a pretty interesting way to even thinking about in relation to like people as vessels for ideas, that like, if you don't want an idea to become too tightly bound to your identity, you can do it under a pseudonym, or you can do it under, there has to be some sort of like, so you can like detach it and throw it away if you want to.
You know, right now we don't have reputation systems on the internet. Well, there's no Yelp for people. And there will someday, right? There'll be different versions of it. And like, for example, should the people let's think of a Yelp for VCs. That's an easy thing that should exist at some point. Will the people who are should it be the real name? Should it be anonymous? Like, what are the, secret was sort of the poster child and Yik Yak for sort of the dangers of anonymity. Well, we have smarter anonymity. Crypto maybe presents a way to provide accountability to anonymity. Do you care? Should I just switch
I care somewhat. I don't know that it's inevitable that we will have something like a Yelp for people, or that like reputation is so context dependent that anytime I try to like really think about how it would work, at least in its most literal form, it's like pretty hard for me to.
Well, even a customized Yelp for like you in a Netflix, for example, you see the thing that's most like suited for you.
But how would you find that?
I guess you'd have to watch some stuff. You tell what you let,
Walk me through your algorithm here.
So there's a Pandora version where you say what people you want to meet, and then it gives you, but then there's also like, you describe in the same way that I am like, you should meet this person and you would connect over these types of things. You can imagine Facebook with all the data they have. You can imagine being like, hey, this person relates to these people, so you might share these things in common.
Sure. I mean, like, I guess, like, I think about like, mutual follows on social platforms is like essentially a version of this. But even those things have limitations, which isn't to say that they shouldn't exist, but I don't know. there's only so much that someone, like, I guess the fundamental question I'm trying to ask is like, how do you actually map someone's personality well enough to be able to recommend them to others? And unless you're going for this purely recommender system of like other people like,
you
and
trust recommend, and that's what we do. That'll be the online version of what we do offline, and that'll be an improvement.
Yeah, I mean, it's an improvement, but like at least on Twitter, I feel like it often becomes purely mimetic, where like sometimes it's just like people follow you or talk to you just because they perceive that other people think that you're interesting, and it's like there's actually like no substance here.
Yeah, that's a Ponzi scheme.
I actually wonder that. I'm like, is this just like whole like social reputation thing is a bubble? I mean, that's the downside of like building it purely off of like mutual recommendations. And then, in terms of like what's inherently good about someone or inherently interesting, I think is actually like pretty tough. When you're originally talking about like reputation systems, about like VCs, I was thinking specifically just about like how these things become a place for people to gripe. Right? I mean, it's true even of Yelp. Yeah. Like you have 1 and 5 star reviews, right? And so you get
but if you had real name, you're less likely to gripe.
If you're reporting with your real name. Yeah. But then you're staking your reputation on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I sort of have the broader thing that like if there's data that's in people's heads and that data is valuable, it's going to exist on the internet. It might not be perfect. It might not be one. It's not going to be one-to-one.
Well, this is the question for me around like there are like VC operates on the asymmetry of information that is traded to valuable people, right? Like there's a whole dark market of information around who's worth talking to and who's not. And like the reason why you can't really, although people have tried, and the reason I guess I'm just like personally don't believe that you can have a venture firm that's based purely on like data or public signaling or whatever is because like the best signals are not public. And I think to some extent that's always true of any social recommender system is, you got to earn that stuff. And it's not super obvious how to get it.
You've written about how, we thought that AngelList or Crunchbase would lead to sort of the best deals being public, and yet they're not.
They're not, right. There's so many promises around this of like, oh, we have the data, and if someone just curated it, but then it's like if everyone could do that, then it's not valuable anymore.
Right. It's inherently based on some form of scarcity, and as soon as that scarcity becomes abundance, people just go to a new club.
Yeah. I've had some very fuzzy thoughts on this that I keep meaning to put into a blog post, and I can't figure out how to quite write about it. But like, there's some kinds of problems that can't quite be externalized because as soon as they become immediately less valuable.
Yeah. I'm curious how things change more on subscription from advertising to subscription. Some people have said, advertising business model is what's wrong with all discourse on the internet. Others, Balaji says that, hey, when journalism becomes subscription based, it's going to be even worse. Like people are going to, fragment into, it's going to be even more polarized, and ValueWise is going to have their, subscriber base, and all these other sort of rags are going to have theirs, and they're really going to pander to what those people want. I have questions over, would people really pay for that type of gossip? Like, is it that valuable that you'd pay for it? But I guess, how do you think about subscription as it relates to polarization, or how do we make the internet less polarized?
Well, I think, again, to even ask the question of how to make the internet less polarized assumes that we're all this global community working to cooperate with each other. And yeah, like I am sure that my views on this are going to be challenged in real time in the next few years. And I will probably have a very different take on this in the near future.
But you don't like that idea.
But yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't actually really see what's so bad about having a super polarized internet, to use that term. Like to me, that
embrace the dysfunctional family of this.
Yeah, like that is what it means to double down on niche communities, is exactly that.
Grow up.
Yeah, get over it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even when we like the perception that sort of like extreme communities are rising now or whatever is a natural extension of, like, to me, it fits into a larger class or umbrella of, niche communities are a thing now, and like some of them you might not like, and like maybe they need to go live somewhere not in the public space, but like they're gonna exist. You can't break them up because people are vessels for ideas, and ideas don't die. So yeah, I mean, I think there's again a difference between how much of that do we allow into the quote unquote public space. And so if we think of like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, as like the purely public space, like I can see an argument being made of if you want to gather and talk about that kind of stuff, then go do it somewhere else. Don't do it here. The same way, like, you know, a lot of US cities would not allow or would not be thrilled about having like KKK members like demonstrating or something, you know, or whatever your extremist group of choice is. Like, people often don't go around like spouting those views in public, but that doesn't mean they don't privately hold them, and you can't control what people believe privately. Right. And you can't prevent people from associating. And so, especially on the internet, they're going to find a way.
Is it an analogy for, you know, so many people had so many utopian visions of what the internet would do for conversation, for so many things, and they were wrong in a bunch of ways. Is the best analogy that sort of having power doesn't change you, it just makes you more of who you are, or being drunk doesn't change, just makes you more of who you are? And is that the best analogy for what the internet has done? Like, it's not the internet has polarized us as much as people were just like naturally gonna, that's what people were thinking. And then now they just expect.
Yeah. Like, I think in general, we just expect way too much out of our tools and technology, and that we expect them to make us better people somehow. And like, I think it's just putting so much pressure on them, because like, we're the ones who make it, we're the ones who use them. And like, they're really, I lean more strongly to this side of like, they're just a reflection of who we are. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't find ways to adapt to that. Like, I think this is sort of where that like one-way mirror analogy I find helpful of like, I think all content as much as possible should be available for people to consume, but like who actually participates in creating it or talking about it, like, is maybe a different group from the people who consume it. So you can imagine like, I don't know, a forum or community where like anyone can read the post, anyone can discover, like, you should be able to discover your tribe or your niche wherever on the internet. And you should be, I think we should be optimizing for like exposure to as many ideas as possible. And like, yeah, but like who actually gets to like, once you've kind of found your tribe, like who gets to actually talk is maybe a separate group, because, or I guess I'm trying to answer that question of like, how do we like make sure that we still get exposed to outside views? And I think like it's fine to be exposed to you can read stuff on Twitter that you really, really hate and disagree with, but it's a different question of whether you should jump into that thread and be like, you know, belligerent or whatever. You're going to get exactly the reaction you expect. So yeah, separating out like the consumption versus participation of content, I think, is useful.
We're talking about local, global. You're negative on global, but, and you sort of rolled your eyes at when I talked about global cooperation, but are you stuck your tongue out, Brett? Do you not believe that we have some needs for global cooperation? And this relates to another idea you talked about, or wrote about in your notes, which is you're curious why hackers are sort of so down on centralization, where centralization is sometimes just more efficient. And hey, sometimes maybe global coordination may be more efficient to solve certain problems.
Yeah, well, and there are some problems that do affect everyone, and we gotta figure out how to deal with them. Yeah, it's really hard to think about. I mean, in the end, like, maybe this is the cynical take. I think about the parallel, I guess, to like global and local politics. And like, one question I've never been able to find a satisfactory answer to is like, why do people pay more attention to like, let's say national politics versus local politics? You would think that like if local means like closer to me and affects me day to day more, like they should be paying more attention to that than to national politics. Yeah. But they don't, obviously. And like, I mean, I guess the best answer I can come with is just that like national politics gets a lot more media coverage and is a lot more like drama filled and fun to follow or whatever. And so maybe similarly, like, yeah, I think in that context, local actually doesn't mean a whole lot, because depending on where you live, like your physical location kind of local might just not be that meaningful to you. So like the underlying lesson for me is kind of like make stuff meaningful to people. And so I think as much as global or national issues, or any issue requiring like larger scale cooperation, can sufficiently attract people and make them feel like they really care about a topic, like they're not necessarily, yeah, I don't see that at odds with the idea of like having like niche communities where you like to spend your time. It's just, right. Yeah, but it's, yeah, the downside of it is like, and I guess has always been true about the circus of politics, is like it requires like getting people's attention and making it feel like it matters to them. And that's often really hard with large scale issues. Like it's really hard to think about the environment because it's like, I don't know, it's so big, and what is one person, like how much can I really affect it, right? That's the problem with like coordination issues of that scale, that like how do you actually make that feel meaningful to someone is pretty tough.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the interplay of how people find meaning in sort of their craft and as a creator and sort of their individual work and even the community that they build as a result of that, but then also how people, for all of human history, have enjoyed sort of submerging themselves in something bigger. They just can't resist the crowd. And you've even written about how mobs have some positive sides too. And how, one, that's just from how people think about meaning, but then two, the story of our time, or the story of progress and the story of increased economic growth is also the story of increased interconnectedness, and that all of our actions affect each other more than they have historically. And that's only increasing in my view. And so, and I think in my view, that's also what libertarians sort of get wrong and need to transfer from like live and let live. Like that's not as we're so much in each other's shit, like on the internet, in real life. And how do, we go from that to like a win and help win, or more of a accept a certain responsibility. And that relates to, I've thought about sort of, there needs to be like a real time balance sheet of the commons. And you sort of maybe you were joking, but you were like, there is no commons. Or how do you think about what comes to mind when I ramble?
I don't remember the context when I told you there was no commons.
You were like, secret. I was like, well, how do you solve the tragedy of commons? And you're like,
yeah,
secret.
Man, I wish I knew. I'm sure I had a really good thought there, but well, I think like, yeah, I may have just been referring to like Ostrom's work around like, there are examples of communities that are sufficiently self-organized enough to manage their own coordination problems without requiring outside intervention from the government or whatever. And so again, I feel like, not to sound like a broken record, but a lot of this comes down to just like making meaning of our membership boundaries, and even finding like I think this is what is so fascinating about this. Like, we're sort of witnessing the birth of an entirely new like dimension of society or whatever. And like a lot of the problems that we're facing in like our online spaces feel like the early frontiers of our physical spaces or whatever, where it's like, we don't actually know who the government is, or like, and not literally the government, but like who has the authority to like monitor each other's actions, or, impose sanctions on people for misbehavior. And like, it's not super clear right now. And like, part of why I said like, mobs do serve some sort of positive function is I think we are all sort of having this reaction of like, oh my God, like you apparently can't say certain things online without having severe repercussions. But maybe what we're seeing is, well, first of all, I don't think people necessarily like long term, maybe people, are not permanently canceled and like everything will be okay. But also like we need to come up with, I think what I think we're witnessing is just sort of the playing around with the boundaries of social norms and like setting norms for how people should behave in quote unquote public. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you can't find other places in like semi-private places, to have those conversations or express yourself, or like more niche communities where you have more context, for someone's words. It doesn't mean that like, I think it's that we expected too much maybe from these like social public spaces, like purely public spaces. And like, yeah, maybe you can't say stuff totally quote unquote in public anymore the same way you can't like in the physical world in public. But as a result, we're going to find ourselves like adapting and finding these like semi-private spaces where it is okay to talk about these kinds of things. And it's not just totally behind like hush closed doors with your friends, but it might even be like other kinds of communities where, yeah, you just find like like-minded people, and it's okay to express yourself over here, but just not over there.
Yeah. It is interesting when we talk about sort of canceling, the mechanism by which you do it is shame. And you've written a post about shamelessness as a strategy. And basically you fight shame by just being shameless. And that has, I don't know, when you talk about that.
Well, yeah. So a friend says to me recently, something like, the only way to avoid being canceled is not to align yourself with the people that are doing the canceling. As in, like, if you always kind of stand by your views and say, like, this is who I am, this is what I believe, I'm not hiding anything, then, like, there's never going to be a moment of, like, oh my gosh, you're actually this totally other person. So similarly, like, the concept of being shamed is, like, it depends on, like, who are you being shamed from? And this is, like, again, like, Ostrom's theory around, like, the commons and sort of how the commons gets managed is like, if you don't care about people sanctioning you for your misbehavior or for saying things that are like that they find distasteful, if you don't care about those people, then like your shamelessness is all it's going to do is serve as this beacon to attract more like-minded people towards you, and it's actually like really positive and good for you. And so, yeah, like shaming and sanctioning only works if you care about the approval of the people who are doing it to you. And so it becomes this weird maybe dangerous and interesting thing to think about. Well, our membership boundaries are so fluid and I operate in so many different contexts and communities. Like in some communities, I can say this thing. Other communities, I know I just can't say this thing over here. But yeah, suddenly it becomes weird of like, who's actually in charge? Who's punishing whom? Like whose like favor am I trying to like get the approval of?
Yeah. Balaji tweeted out this story about how someone like raised money for cancer on the internet by doing, I don't know, this innocuous thing. Like it's a really great thing. And then a journalist wrote, like found an old tweet of theirs and then canceled them. And then someone else found a tweet of that journalist and then canceled him. And it was like all within a day.
Everyone got canceled.
Yeah, mutually assured cancellation.
Right. That is definitely a thing.
Yeah. You know, one way is to, just make it easier to go to these sort of local or dark forests, know what you can say here and know what you can't say there. Another additional way is to sort of try to, Robert Wright has this, in his book Non-Zero, talks about with every increase in social complexity or interconnectedness, you need moral progress is what he calls it to meet that complexity. And so Twitter puts us all in the same room at the same time. And maybe we need just better etiquette or better conversational etiquette. And I'm surprised that, and you're starting to see it on a small scale, but I'm surprised that hasn't really taken off more.
What would etiquette?
Oh, like, steel manning arguments or, not dunking on people. Or just certain, I'm surprised that we don't shame the shaming in some way, or shame certain elements of conversation that are, there's this Twitter account called "Is This Art or Not?" and you just CC it whenever you want to know if something's art, and it says yes, and it's sort of a meme. And I'm curious if there should be like is this tribalism or not? Like, is this just pandering? Like, we could find certain patterns and certain trends that just sow discord, and could you? Yeah, recognize that, identify like the Mott and Bailey fallacy or something, or I don't know, certain things that people.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a funny way. It feels like we're sort of reliving early internet days again, where like there was, such the well-trodden slogan or whatever of like, don't feed the trolls, right? Yeah. And like, avoid flame wars. And like, if you spend any time on like any internet forum, it was always just like, God, don't feed these people, you idiot. And you just know, like, I just don't pander that kind of behavior. And yet, like, somehow it's like we're all like collectively relearning that behavior in public, where it's like when someone is being like hysterical towards you, like just like the greatest like currency we actually have is like not giving someone your attention. And I do think you are like starting to see this more, but just very slowly and there are always going to be people who just like want to engage and escalate and like lean into the drama, but like the best thing we can all really do is just like don't feed the trolls, just don't give them your attention. And
my friend just blocks them. I'm wondering if I should just block them.
Yeah, well,
like,
and
prematurely.
That's like coming back to again like the ways our platforms need to adapt is like giving people the tools to like moderate themselves or help other. If you're like an individual who gets a ton of attention or like has a lot of followers or whatever, like your community around you, quote unquote, like whatever that looks like, should be able to help like filter stuff out for you. Yeah, a lot of this is like you can't solve. Yeah, canceling is like a very crude mechanism for trying to figure out how to introduce sanctions and make them meaningful. But in the end, if we kind of fall back on just like tribalism and niche communities, it's like, it's fine. You can say this stuff over there, but like, how do you just make it so that like I don't see it is like maybe a different kind of problem.
So interesting how there's sort of different levels of abstractions of in-group, out-group. Like the NBA China thing is such an interesting example where it's like, you have all this in-group, out-group over like, Steve Kerr and Donald Trump. Oh, that's pretty wide, but they're on different teams. And then, when there's like a strong China and they're like, then you should be on the same team. I mean, you just sort of one level of abstraction. Oh, wait, now we're on the same team. It is interesting. I mean, we sort of have different instincts on this where yours is sort of, hey, boundaries, platforms should help, and just, know what you say here, know what you don't say here. And hey, you don't need to connect with the entire world. Like you have your community. That's all you need. And I resonate with a lot of that, but my instinct is more like, no, let's come together. Global brain. Like we just need to see each other's perspectives better.
Totally. I mean, like, and again, like, I think it's very much a reflection of, well, my and your personality that like, I'm sort of the like slinking around cat of just like, I don't need you people. I'm just going to be here with my people over here or whatever. And you're like, come together.
Love me.
Yeah, the dog mentality. And so like any position that I take on this stuff, I kind of throw out the world as like, here's more things we can be thinking about, but I think we're all trying to figure it out together right now. And I'm very open to like, I might just be completely wrong about the future.
Right.
But I just want more perspectives on this stuff.
How do you think the shaming stuff all resonate when everyone has their 15 minutes of shame? Do we get tired of it eventually, or is it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, already people are getting kind of tired of it, right?
Do people just stop doing it, or how do we regulate behavior?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's where part of me does wonder whether we're like all we're really witnessing is the creation of a public space, and like it is a little bit of like a birth by fire, where it's like, no, you can't say all this stuff in public anymore, and then people just kind of learn to like self-moderate a little bit. And then maybe things will just sort of even out. And or like, I mean, like the classic thing that I think about is like how people's views have changed around celebrities and like nude photos or any sort of like sexually explicit material that gets leaked. And that used to be like a career ending thing, right? And now it's like there are celebrities who voluntarily do that stuff and like gain a lot of respect for it, right? It's like at some point it didn't become this like weird, shameful thing. It was just like, yeah, I can show my body, like who cares? And so maybe similarly, there are, things we might have previously gotten super up in arms about. And like, eventually it's just like, look, we all have things we say sometimes that like, our views change over time. Please don't hold me to like a tweet that I sent 10 years ago. I'm a different person now. So yeah, I mean, at some point I think people are just sort of unimpressed with it. But I do think the canceling as a social mechanism or something, like what it has done is to draw the line around a public space and say like there is, no matter what the outcome is, like we have now like I think irrevocably create this space to say like you just can't say some stuff in public, but that's okay. You can say them now. It now gives birth to these sort of like semi-public spaces or semi-private spaces to have those conversations.
We talked about identity. We talked about reputation. I want to hear your thoughts on status. Eugene Wei had the great post status as a service. Naval's tweeted out a few times this version of like, wealth is positive sum because the more you make, the more other people can make too. Status is negative sum because you're zero sum because you're taking it from other people. I think he's sort of simplifying it by comparing wealth creation to status negotiation. But like what creators are doing is they're also, actually, people who create the platforms, more precisely probably, are creating new forms of status by like, if you get to be a Vine star, yeah, you might be, competing over who has more followers or something, but that didn't exist before, and you would have been trying to play high school football or like there's sort of status by creating new games, new websites, new platforms. You create new avenues for people to have fans, to be fans, and there'll be scarcity within that, but you can sort of keep creating infinite variations of status games, even to the point where you have, AI fans. So everyone's number one in something. How do you think about the positive sumness or zero sumness of status? And broadly, how do you think about how status changes on the internet?
Well, as you were talking, I'm pretty sure I've had other, probably more interesting thoughts on status in the past that I can't recall anymore. So I'm just going to go fresh with whatever came to mind when you were talking, which is because we've been talking so much about like niche localized meaning. Like something I've thought about, I guess, with reputation is that in some ways reputation is extremely tied to who you are. It's very unique to you. And in other ways, it's actually quite fungible in that like, and I think I wrote about this in that post about people as vessels for ideas, that like you can, if as a listener, I'm looking, say I'm like listening to Spotify or something, I'm looking for songs that fit my a certain like mood or sound I want to evoke. But like, increasingly now, like I'm not always aware of like who made the song. It's like I just like this song, and like I just listen to a playlist of the songs I've liked versus like albums from people that I follow. And if I don't get the sound from this particular song, I'll just listen to another one. I was actually thinking about this recently with like Ninja leaving Twitch, right? Who was like top streamer. There is a question of he can kind of go off, and there's some amount of his audience that's gonna inevitably follow him, but like for the people that remain on Twitch, like there might just be a new Ninja, right? And like maybe that's heresy for like I'm sure they're diehard Ninja fans that are just gonna like follow him wherever, but like yeah, when one person goes away, another one just kind of crops up, right? And so when I think about I wonder if status is kind of at odds with this idea of like niche localized audiences where you don't really need to be competing. You're not really competing against other creators who are doing similar things as you, because like when you're competing on that realm, then you are quite fungible. But when you're really just talking about your local specific audiences just devoted to you as a person for whatever reason, they developed some attachment to you. That's actually like playing a very different kind of game.
In the future, so how do people seek status on the internet in the future?
Maybe my point is that they're not. Or it's, and I'm just trying this stuff out. I haven't really thought deeply about it, but like, is status a global game and like reputation is a local one? Where, yeah, I mean, the leaderboard only matters when you're talking about like other people on the same platform as you, but yeah, it just doesn't matter if you have your own audience that's going to follow you no matter what.
I want to talk about progress. There's been a lot of popularity around this idea of progress studies, sort of making sort of a somewhat academic discipline of how do we create more progress and better appreciate all the things that progress, i.e. economic growth and ideas of the Enlightenment have, in Steven Pinker's sense, have brought to us. And there are things that we talked about that you are very excited about, but you also, you had a note of is the scientific methods, it was sort of joking, but lean startup for science. And what you were trying to point out is that it's somewhat reductive and that you think perhaps progress by itself somewhat, doesn't make space for sort of mysticism or magic, however you define it. When do you go off?
Thank you for making me sound like a crackpot. Yeah, a bunch of different thoughts there.
Yeah.
Science, man. Yeah, I mean, I have mixed thoughts on what progress really means. And I think like functionally, probably a lot of people share this view, even people that love talking about progress, but it is sort of this question of like progress towards what, or like progress to what.
You're a witch. Cancel.
Burn the witch. Just kidding. And so, yeah, like I think, I guess like one of the things I'm interested in, like when I think about like, say, progress studies or just like the deep understanding of progress as a concept, something that I hope will happen is that it is very closely tied to practice. Like I think one of the like valid criticisms of academia today is that a lot of this stuff is happening in ivory towers or is not super closely tied to practice. I think that's maybe even the appeal of science is that it's reproducible. And so I hope that it doesn't just become this like a historical look at like what maybe what's worked in the past and is more closely tied to like the problems that we're facing today and like directly trying to like apply that research and learnings to like the stuff we're doing now, which I think would be really cool. When I think about like progress from like a purely philosophical angle, one thing I wonder about sometimes is like, I don't know, we talk about like growth, we talk about accelerating progress or like, making it happen faster. And it's sort of like, I think like the only way we can really understand progress is from this like present day vantage point. And like, when we look back on history or whatever, and we think about like, well, that was progress, like our conception of what progress means changes all the time. It changes generationally. It's very contextually dependent on some people. One person's idea of progress is another person's idea of stagnation. And so there's no way to really understand the concept of progress without it being very contextually dependent. And so I understand progress, I guess, is like a catch-all term for how do we make things happen, I guess, because it is so defined by present day expectations and norms and interests. Like it's, I think, constantly going to just be like recombined and redefined over time of like, yeah, what do we actually consider progress to be?
But are they mostly talking about economic growth?
I don't know. I think that's the question to me is like, but what is progress? And yeah, like to some extent, I think I would like to focus on like specific terms. And maybe that is the work ahead, right? Is like figuring out like, what does that actually really mean? How would we even measure it? But even that act of getting more specific and getting more measurable feels a lot like the scientific method to me, right? It's creating things that are reproducible. And yeah, all my interest in magic and mysticism or whatever, as you so succinctly put it, is wanting to see this, like, I guess, balancing out of like, science is inherently very legible and reproducible, or I guess I hesitate to even say that because there are a lot of things about science that are mystical and unknowable as well. And maybe like the most beautiful parts of science are that. But there is a striving towards the legible or something like that. Like and that's like, I mean, embodied in the scientific method is like you should be able to just do like these steps and like get to an answer, and then other people should be able to like reproduce that same answer. And like, but there are an entire like class of problems, and especially when I think we're talking about people like and social dynamics that are just like don't really fit neatly into that, because our brains are these black boxes and we don't actually know all the variables that are involved, and they change all the time, and they are so contextually dependent that it's like an answer that works right now is not good. It's not going to be the same answer in the future.
You have this quote, the more I yearn for it, the more I seek to categorize it and name it, the farther astray I know I am.
Yeah, it's a friend of mine who said that. Yeah.
And so I think the fundamental crux difference here is, and I think we're on the same side here, that we see the world as somewhat indeterminate, that not everything can be, and scientists, or true scientists, often see it as determinate. Like, we just don't know it yet, but we will. We'll codify it, we'll quantify it, markets will come on and do their thing to it. And we say that sort of reduces the magic or mysticism. But another way of putting it, some people say, is that it treats a complex system using complicated mechanisms, and complicated things are like a Boeing 747 that, we don't know how it's made, but if you get 1,000 of us or whatever, we can create it. Whereas like 1,000 people are not going to understand how the human brain works because
no one does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I would qualify even to say it's not, like, oddly, I think a lot of scientists I talk to are very captivated by the mystical and indeterminate. But it's almost like there's this weird, like, secondary, like, cult of science, maybe, that is, like, separate, where it's, like, yeah, it's more about a way of doing things, or seeing the world as very literal and legible and reproducible, which, yeah, it doesn't always overlap with scientists themselves. Oh, yeah. So, like, right, complex systems, the thought stream I always come back to around this is from Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she talks about these systems of, like, organized complexity. And in contrast to, like, there are problems that have, like, 2 known variables, or, like, maybe, like, hundreds of known variables. But then there are problems that have, like, unknown amounts of variables, and, like, most people problems are like that, where we just don't know what's going on in any individual's head. And until we know, which, like, we probably won't, and maybe we should accept that we don't, it's pretty hard to just say, like, it's hard to apply scientific methods to that. And I think to try to force these scientific methods onto these kinds of problems is to misunderstand and maybe mistreat, I guess what makes me sad is whenever I think about, like, problems or disciplines that have formed around that, like, let's say, like, economics or nutrition or psychology or whatever, like, all these end up being taken as, like, quote unquote, like, pseudosciences and, like, discounted. And that's sort of sad, because it's like they're always trying to compare it against science. You'd be like, well, it's not a real science. It's like, okay, maybe it's not, but like there's something else. And instead of being an inferior version of science, like, why can't they just be, like, something else entirely? Like, maybe we're just thinking about the problem wrong, and we're trying to make it, like, this, like, yeah, very determinate answer versus, like, accepting the inherent weirdness of it all. And I think, like, the method, like, primarily, like, if I were just sort of coarsely think about differences in methodologies, like, I think these organized complexity type problems are a lot more bottom up, like, inductive kind of reasoning. Like, a lot of it comes from just, this is, like, where, like, anthropology becomes really interesting. And, like, a lot of it's just, like, observing what normal people are doing or whatever, observing what your subjects are doing, and then trying to, like, zoom out and, like, create, like, theories or hypotheses around that is different from saying, from, like, I guess a more, like, top down kind of approach.
Yeah. I used to ask this question. I haven't asked it in years, but I thought of it just now. Who do you think is closest to the truth? Like, the best novelists, economists, anthropologists, mystics, yoga teachers, scientists, artists? I don't know, who is, like, the best grasp, or the one you most resonate with, perhaps?
Eric, I categorically hate answering best favorite type questions, which I think is I actually just had a conversation with friends about this last night, because, like, about, like, why I hate any of those, like, the best
podcast.
Right. But I think it's actually, like, exactly the problem we're talking about right now, which is sort of, like, you're saying there is some objective comparative way to, like, do this, but, like, it's not. There is actually, the whole point is, like, you can't compare people in this way at all.
Who's in your top 3? I'm just kidding. why hasn't the internet created new religions? Like wholesale, and maybe they have in just different ways, but like, I don't know, we have new social platforms every 40 years or whatever. Why don't we know, like Christianity and Islam, Judaism, I don't, like wholesale new ones? I don't know.
I mean, I think they totally do exist. As you're asking that question, okay, I got a hot take for you. So I think like there's this conversation around like, is progress slowing down, specifically scientific or economic progress, or like maybe another version of this is like science or academia is like a broken system or something. And like, I think at first I found these ideas intriguing, and now I kind of feel like, they're actually not really broken. They're just kind of like mature or whatever. But it's sort of like an overstated, like, it's a form of in-grouping signaling or something to be like, progress is slowing down. What do we do? And it's like, but like, I don't know if it's necessarily true. And anyway, so I feel like that question around like, why have we not created new religions, or we need new religions or whatever, like people don't have religion or whatever, is like the mystical corollary of the progress is slowing down question of like, I think they're all there, and for whatever reason we just like don't want to talk about it, but I think it's almost like a signaling thing of like, we need religion, people need meaning in their lives. And it's like, I think people do a pretty good job finding meaning in their lives now. Like, yeah, maybe the question is like, why don't we have like faith-based, like a literal religion kind of thing is like maybe a fair question. But I think we find, if we think about religion as like broadly serving two goals, like one is like organizing people, giving them a sense of community, and the other is like personal sense of meaning, spirituality, whatever. Like, I think people find plenty of ways to recreate that in their lives. So maybe it's just that religion itself is becoming obsolete. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'd build it in a different way, which is community and then truth, or like we talked about it, and that internet serves at scale. But truth in terms like, where do we come from? Who are we? What should we be doing? What is real? And I think that's a lot harder for people, because you live and you're sort of, no one has the same information as you do. And can you really trust yourself? Like, what is reality is a lot harder of a question when everyone's got a different story.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if I buy it.
I don't know if the internet serves that one as much. Maybe I'm speaking for personal.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I do think it's easier to find weird niche communities than ever before.
That share your story, basically.
Yeah, and in terms of, I guess, maybe answering that, like, but why am I here and what am I doing kind of thing, like, yeah, maybe that is an aspect that is more lost. Maybe and I'm just, thinking out loud. Maybe I take a more hardline stance around, like, maybe we're just overthinking it. Like, I guess what I'm trying to do is like extract what are the parts of religion that like, maybe like I guess like the reason why when people talk about this, need for religion or whatever, like sometimes I kind of bristle out because I'm just sort of like, I wonder if we're just taking the concept of religion too literally. And so it's like, how much can we break it down to be like, all right, what is the actual whatever? And so like part of it is just like traditional structures maybe that like that reduce the amount of thinking that you have to do, right? And like, I think if we have those kinds of structures, like that's, I don't know, if we maybe the tides will turn back towards like a more traditional means of organizing ourselves socially. And
well, things like meditation are big. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if like the Sabbath takes off is like really big.
By finding some sort of like traditions, or just like traditions are just sort of like social versions of like, don't repeat yourself, right? Of like, there's like codified, like, how much can we like not have to keep thinking about this thing over and over again? Just say like, this is what it is, and like turn your brain off and do it. And so like reducing choice in some ways, or having constraints, can create that.
You're interested in the concept of freedom as it relates to constraints. Yeah.
This thing I've been reflecting on recently, coming off of a really great setup that I had with Protocol Labs, where they enabled me to just do my own totally unconstrained independent research, which feels like a dream kind of situation of you're just supported to do the work that you want to do. And I think about a lot in relation to patronage, grant type funding models where like oftentimes there's this sort of yearning for like, if only we just let creative people do what they wanted to do and just gave them like, you know, a blank check to go run with their ideas. And I think my experience over the past year and a half or whatever, has really helped me understand maybe the other side of freedom, which is that like you also need constraints to make things meaningful. Otherwise, especially I think when you're doing creative work, because like otherwise you can really just spin out forever thinking about stuff. And even if you're thinking about it out loud, it's sort of like, well, how do I make meaning from this? When you can do anything you want, then it's like, well, then what is even meaningful? And so that was the thing that I had to learn how to do, like in my own personal work. And just sort of changed. It gave me a new respect actually for like limited amounts of funding. Like I think I understand better now why grants sometimes come in, you know, like 4-year cycles or whatever, instead of like unlimited funding into perpetuity, because you also want to make space for like new people to come in and like, yeah, you just need some sort of constraint. Like I understand now why researchers have fellowships that are, you know, 1 to 3 years long, because it forces you to say, all right, I've got, you know, 3 years here. I need to figure out how to make something meaningful out of this. Otherwise you're just kind of doing it forever. And so, yeah, I mean, it also applies to what we were just talking about socially, right? Is like when you can, I think we were maybe raised in a generation of that was trying to just like do everything and have it all, and was just like very much pushing that narrative. And I think there is some value to thinking through like constraints do give people meaning in life.
So I want to end by talking about 2 topics, cults and China. So first, just cult. I mean, there is sort of this fascination with cults. I guess, you know, the fall of perhaps traditional religion means the rise of cults. I guess is a cult just a really intense community? Like, how do you think about cults? What's your interest in it, or what do you think about it?
I mean, I would really just call myself a casual observer of cults. Yeah. Please don't get ahead of ourselves here. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, like, one thing as I was thinking about this transition from, like, many to many distributed community models to this, like, one-to-many kind of broadcastery model that we're seeing today, is thinking of them as cults. I was trying to think about, like, you know, cults versus communities. I was like, it's not really great branding for people, so maybe I shouldn't call it cults. But I think, like, there are interesting parallels around, like, you're one person controlling an audience, and, like, how do you manage that? Ultimately, I feel like the one-to-many model is actually pretty different from a cult. But yeah, it's interesting just to think about, like, narrative dictates so much of our lives. And, like, the right story can make people do just about anything, which is pretty nuts. And how do we create those narratives in our lives, hopefully for non-nefarious purposes?
It's funny, I didn't actually mean to connect those, but I saw this thread by Josh Wolf where he talked about how China bought the government bought like 10 movie companies or something to make sure that there was never a Chinese supervillain. And there hasn't been one in like decades or something, which is pretty fascinating use of narrative. Like not even like make more Chinese superheroes, just make sure that they're not the villain. It seems, or it's one to many. It seems increasingly like one of the things we're talking about is just like increasing in a positive, like voyeurism. Like being able to think out loud and people come in or being able to have conversations and people be a fly on the wall. Just like voyeurism as a version of intimacy. Therapists in some way, right? It's like, even if you wrote about how they don't even need to necessarily like say anything super interesting. Even just the fact that they're there, you get to speak to them, process out loud in front of someone else, gives you a sense of being heard or being like it's a service to you. I had this idea for an app where, so I think parts of therapy are just like a racket, basically. Did I tell you about this? Where like it's called Vent. Basically, you get like a college student or like customer service person or someone who's a good listener, and you pay like $20 an hour so everyone can afford it, and or a lot more people can afford it, and you just vent to them, and you're not expecting them to like solve your problems, but they're like doing a service. And also, one of the best ways to actually feel better about yourself is to listen to other people talk about their problems and how bad their life is. So you would actually also pay to be the listener. And so we would make money off both. I'm half joking about the pay to be a listener, but there is some, and this voyeur, like there's some joy to being understood even if it serves zero purpose. Just someone is there. And then, I don't know about you listeners, but I get a lot of joy after just hearing people vent. And not in a Schadenfreude way, but in a perspective type way.
This is, I think, one of the just big underlying drivers of patronage or this increased focus on like niche communities is, I write about this a little bit around the idea of like newsletters and like why people subscribe and why they fall in love with a stranger, right? And there is something about the newsletter style that is a little bit different from blogging. I mean, there are many different kinds of newsletters, but sort of this like more personal newsletter kind of voice that is a little bit more stream of consciousness and a little bit more like, here's what I'm thinking, I'm going to put it in your inbox. And like, you can kind of do this thought experiment of like, you know, if someone were to just like dump their unfiltered thoughts to you like once a week for years, like, you might not care in the beginning, but if you like absolutely had to read it every single, you were like forced to, at some point, if they stopped doing it, you'd be like, wait, like I've gotten super engrossed in your story. Like I want to know what happens next. But like the interesting thing is like, it doesn't really matter what you slot in there. Like it could be the most mundane thing. I mean, this is like the beauty of like great like novelists, I think, right? Is like they manage to take things that maybe more short story writers, but just great writers is like they're able to take something that feels incredibly mundane or trivial or something you just haven't really thought a whole lot about, and they can make it like the most fascinating story. And so similarly, I think this like idea of like voyeurism as a form of intimacy, as you were saying, is really well suited to this like one-way mirror kind of model of like, I can just be here like thinking out loud. I can just be sort of like dumping things out into the world, and like someone might read it and I don't even really know who they are. I'm not necessarily talking to them. Like we might not even really know each other. But like if they're forced into the routine of just for whatever reason, maybe they just can't stop looking at it, you know? Yeah. I mean, it's just like a train wreck or something in the beginning. They just can't stop looking, but like they eventually end up in this routine of like, I want to see what happens next, even if they don't necessarily have any reason for caring about who you are. And that's kind of a really interesting thing to think about.
Totally. And I think a couple of the things that motivate this sort of voyeurism is this idea, one of just like, hey, I'm in my head all day. It's cool to like take a break and be in someone else. But then also like one way to feel understood is to have someone, you know, just listen to you vent for a while. Another way to feel understood is to have someone else vent or show like, you know, some aesthetic that they really like and be like, oh, I like that too. or I didn't even know I liked it, but that's like hitting my, you know, psychic cherries or whatever. Like that's stimulating something for me. And, you know, novels and films are sort of this more like formal, well-produced, and they're still fantastic and serve their roles. But this sort of like one Instagram photo here, one like tweet here, one like just 2-minute vlog of like, you know, staying in on the things get more and more mundane and relatable. And that's why people, there's this cult of vulnerability, or people are searching for vulnerability or authenticity as this. Yeah, me too. It's just a desire to connect.
The most masterful expressions that I've seen was at a Taylor Swift concert last year, where she's performing in this stadium. I think it was like, whatever. It was like ginormous stadium. And she's like, you know, one person performing. And like, I just went with, some friends. Like well, whatever. I love Taylor Swift. Whatever. Yeah, okay, fine. But yeah, I hadn't been to a Taylor Swift concert before, so I didn't really know what to expect. I don't really go to like large pop concerts. So it was like a new experience for me. I guess like I'm guessing it's actually fairly common among other pop stars. But she's like managing this thing where she's like, you know, playing her music and talking on screen. Her face is like huge on the screen or whatever. And she's talking in the most intimate, personal way to her fans of saying like, you know, you guys have been with me throughout this whole experience over the years as we've gotten to know each other. Not you guys getting to know me, but like as we've gotten to know each other, like I couldn't have done this journey without you. And it was just so like effusively, personal. And at first I was like, wow, this is really nice. And then I was like, oh wow, this is just like incredibly masterful she managed to create this feeling of intimacy while literally speaking to like a stadium full of fans. And I'm sure they love it. And, just to me, like I had this mental image of like seeing her do that on stage as sort of this like very performative aspect that, I don't think has to be like manipulative or bad or anything. It's just sort of like, again, when you have this space, when you have a little bit of a wall or a separation between like you and your audience, and you can kind of just like brain dump in public, like, you know, she like, as I kind of saw, was just sort of like brain dumping out loud, and like, but it was like beautiful to watch it happen to this enormous audience. You can actually engender a feeling of intimacy, which is to like tens of thousands of people, which is really cool.
Yeah, I always thought that like being a celebrity is good for other people and less good for you. Social, like, unless you can find ways to put boundaries around it and create meaning off that. I mean, while we're on the Taylor Swift train, I've been thinking about Kanye West recently, and what he represents as in terms of like the times that are changing, the times they are changing. So, I mean, Kanye said George Bush hates black people in 2004 on the brink of Hurricane Katrina, and then at a concert, 3 weeks, just released a sort of basically right wing gospel album, and was saying a concert like they is now a black conservative, and he's saying a Trump supporter and saying, hey, they can't control what we think. Like, why are there no black conservatives? And there's something deep or really interesting there. I mean, partially he's contrarian, but saying Bush hated black people wasn't that contrarian at the time. But I guess, how do you think about the transformation of Kanye West in light of sort of how internet culture has changed and how maybe we view celebrities as changed? Like,
I don't know if they have any like particularly interesting nuanced takes on Kanye, except that, kind of everything. I mean, like in some ways, he just really embodies, I think, the transition that a lot of people are collectively experiencing. And I think it's really interesting. People like him, like I think back to like when Miley Cyrus was doing her thing of being like super over the top, and like, everyone's just like so quick to blame it on. And like, I don't purport to know anything of these people's personal private lives or whatever, but all I'm doing is like observing like a lot of the reaction of sort of discounting their actions by saying like, oh, they must be mentally ill or on drugs or like they've gone crazy. Like so many people say Kanye's gone crazy, and like, who knows, maybe he is going crazy. I don't know him. But I think it takes away a little bit from like whatever is going on inside his head. Like at least whatever he's externally producing, I think resonates a lot with, what a lot of people are feeling. And it's almost like a failed form of sanctioning, again, to kind of go back to that of like saying like, you must be crazy or something. And people trying to sort of like punish that sort of behavior of being kind of outlandish or whatever. But they're missing the fact that like that level of outlandishness is actually attracting a lot of like-minded people who are like kind of coming out of the woodwork and being like, oh, I also feel this way. And so they end up being more successful than like, I feel like the sanctioning and the punishing actually ends up like drawing more attention towards them.
Yeah. This does segue into China a little bit. Like there seems to be, the transition you were talking about, I think, not to put words in your mouth, but like people are going from left to right. and that seems to happen in society. Like it is interesting. The Cold War, like, U.S. was right, or at least U.S. was capitalist, China was communist. Now it's like the reverse. And not that U.S. is communist, but it's like so far left, and China is much more right, at least on social issues. You have written about China, like thinking about it as representational democracy, or maybe you had one line about it in one of your notes.
I think there is maybe an interesting, this kind of gets back to, at least, I think for like our generation growing up, it was very much about emphasizing democracy, participation, like every voice considered, which also reflects the culture of the early days of the internet. And we're seeing, we were pushed this idea of like total freedom. And then like once everyone had total freedom, then it became a little bit like, oh no, now like I don't have any meaning. And also like we're all clashing with each other. So like how do we find constraints again, and how do we find, and I think like a lot of people are just sort of looking for someone to like tell them what to do. Maybe this gets to your sense of coming around on that whole like loss of religion thing or whatever, loss of personal meaning. And so it's interesting to think about like how that should be reflected in our government. I guess just thinking about like like there are some aspects of democracy that just don't scale, and there are also sometimes there's a benefit of having like when the choices aren't necessarily like we're being asked to weigh in on a lot of things that might not even be meaningful or affect us. And so how do you find meaning in being a citizen again? And there are other approaches to it that involve that have like just take a different approach from the US that are where I think, we tend to highly emphasize the feeling like a participant, feeling like a citizen, and but finding ways to like preserve that at scale is difficult.
The analogy right now in my head for the US-China thing is like it's a coming of age tale where you're sort of like, you notice something early on in life that you know to be true, 100% true, and you're like fighting for it, and you have these, villains who are obviously wrong, and you defeat them, and you get even more confident, you get to high school now, and then you meet this like other person who's doing something totally different than you, and they're like, it's like working out, and the most recent people you tried to conquer like didn't really like your way of life, and it's like, wait, maybe I wasn't like as right as I thought, or as like uniquely right as I thought, and maybe there are other ways to be right, or maybe I'm wrong, or maybe not. I don't know. I don't know how to think about it.
Right. Broadly speaking, we're seeing, Francis Fukuyama had this, end of history essay or whatever. And like, it's so crazy to think about. I mean, I guess I can tap into some aspect of like maybe like childhood or teenager years, maybe where like, everyone really bought into the liberal democracy model. And like,
and the end of history was saying that, hey, liberal democracy is how the rest of the world is going to be run.
Yeah, it was saying like we basically won. We proved out that Western liberal democracy is the best form of government. Like, is this the end of history because we just did all the things we're gonna do, right? And again, I think this comes back to my just wanting to like get more specific around like what we mean about progress, because like I think at that point in time we would have said like the pinnacle of progress, at least according to Fukuyama and his contemporaries, were like, the pinnacle of progress is like this liberal democracy model that we have like championed around the world, and like we've toppled, governments that didn't buy into it and installed this everywhere. And like, and now you fast forward 20 years and it's not just that didn't pan out. That would be one thing. But it's that even the way we value liberal democracy has actually changed. Like, there are a lot of people who would say that is not actually the pinnacle peak form of government. And in fact, there were like a lot of problems with it that were revealed over the decades that followed. And so suddenly it's like, wait, what is progress? Like, are we striving towards the liberal democracy model, or are we trying to come up with something else? And I don't know what that other thing would be. Like, I mean, my personal view is like, as much as we all, the Churchill thing or whatever of like, as much as we hate democracy, it's worst form of government besides all other forms. So I don't have answers necessarily on what's better, but it is interesting to think about like the ways in which it has maybe failed our expectations. Maybe our expectations were too high around like what we expected that government to do. And that in a way, I think that goes back to this thing of like, I think we just put so much pressure on our tools, our technology. And like, to me, government is a tool in that sense. And in that, government should only really reflect the needs and will of its people, that we expect these like laws to do like all the work for us or whatever. It's like, no, this is like an actively evolving thing. And there's never going to be a point where it's like, oh, liberal democracy made us good people and now we're done. This is the end of history. It's like, that's just not going to happen.
My guest today has been Nadia Eghbal. You can check out her work at nadiaeghbal.com. Subscribe to her newsletter if you like the ideas and made it this far.
Thanks for having me, Erik.
Thank you for coming on. It's been fun. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.